I'm joined by Sister Brittany Culver with the Aliança de Santa Maria. Her faith journey is one that has taken her from Protestant and non-denominational churches to Catholicism, and from a life in the United States to a life in religious community in Fatima, Portugal. It's a beautiful story and one that accompanies today's theme very well of Be Not Afraid. So Sister Brittany, we'll start with this. What was your family life like growing up, and how did your family practice your Christian faith?
Well, I'm the oldest of 8 kids, and I suppose if you were to ask a Franciscan, she would talk a little bit about poverty. If you asked a Carmelite, she'd probably talk about Teresa of Avila. I'm going to talk a little bit about my story with the filter of the message of Fatima. And I'd like to talk a little bit about somebody that really helped me. Her life story has a lot to do with mine. I'm going to talk a little bit about Sister Lucia and the apparitions that she had throughout her life, and how they helped her discover the face of God. First, I'd like to talk about an apparition that happened. A lot of people don't know about it. That happened in 1915. It was a weird moment. She was about 7 years old, and she was out with her sheep and a couple of friends of hers. And randomly, she saw what looked like a statue made out of light, out of snow. She couldn't understand what it was at the time. And later, when her mother questioned her about it, she really couldn't describe what she had seen. She said it kind of looked like a person without eyes, hands, that was wrapped up in a sheet, not sheep. And I like to think about this apparition because it kind of reminds me of my time as a Protestant believer. I grew up in a non-denominational, but very denominational church. We believed in the 3 solas, sola scriptura, which means the Bible alone, sola fide, grace, faith alone, and sola gratia, which is grace alone. And I felt a little bit, I feel often, that when people ask me about my conversion story, they want to hear about my first Mass. They want to hear about that first time I entered in the Catholic Church. But my story doesn't really start there. I was a little bit of the Johnny Cash of the Protestant church because I've been everywhere. Baptists, Lutherans, Calvinists, Evangelicals, Pentecostals. My parents, my brothers and sisters, and I, we traveled all over the place looking for the right church. We saw all of the different denominations. We changed our Bibles 100 times. Always looking for God, looking for the truth. And as a kid and a young adult, the main way that God spoke to me was through His Word, the Scriptures. God became a part of my life, much like this apparition of Lucia. It was a figure, always present. He always existed. But like her, often I could say that He didn't really have a defined shape. He didn't really have hands or eyes. He was just kind of a presence in my life. And with all of this constant moving around in the Protestant church, I grew older. I grew a little more independent. And I finally told my parents if the Bible was enough, and the Bible was in my hands and within reach, I didn't really need the church. I told my parents that I was no longer going to go to any church whatsoever. And I started to do my own personal Bible study and prayer life on my own without really entering into any kind of church whatsoever. So that was up until young adulthood.
What was it about the Catholic Church that gave God that shape, as in your words? And was it difficult, or was it liberating to accept the authority that the Catholic Church claimed? Well,
I would say that the first time that I entered into a Catholic church wasn't exactly with an open spirit. Like I said, I had decided not to go to any other church. And my mom called me up one day and asked if I had wanted to go with her to a mass. And thankfully, we weren't Catholic haters. There are some Protestant denominations that are a little more against the church. We didn't really believe in that. If somebody had asked me about the Catholic Church, I probably would have said it's just another branch of Christianity. But that didn't mean I was going to any mass. But thankfully, my mom, with a lot of insistence and a little bit of Italian-style mom guilt, convinced me to go to a mass for her birthday. And here's where, yeah, that's the big story, where I entered into the Catholic Church, unhappily, a little bit forced, obligated. And I started to notice things that I couldn't argue with. I started to hear the scriptures, lots of scriptures. And I noticed things that reminded me of the Old Testament, like the priest that washed his hands before the sacrifice of the bread and the wine. I even remember thinking, when I looked at the tabernacle, which was all gold and super fancy looking, I remember thinking of the Holy of Holies that I had read about so often in the Old Testament. And I left that mass very confused and a little afraid, because I couldn't understand what the heck was going on. And with this, I'd like to return to my friend, my friend Lucia, because a year or so after this weird apparition that she has with this faceless figure, she has another apparition, this time with her two cousins. And it is an angel that appears to her, and he starts by saying, "Don't be afraid." And there's a series of prayers that he teaches her, and he finally ends his series of apparitions by showing her the Eucharist. And I feel every time that I read the memories, I'm like, yeah, that's me, because Lucia was taught over a period of time. She entered into prayer, and she finished with the grace of the Eucharist. And I feel like the time from that very first Mass until my baptism was a period of apparitions just like this, where God showed himself to me with a completely different face, and taught me in the sacraments a new concrete way of living out my faith that I hadn't had it up until now. I was very afraid. I understood that being Catholic is a commitment. It's not something you're born into. And it's also something that changes you. And change is always scary. Change is always something that makes us afraid, naturally. But I continued to go to Mass. At first, I went to Mass with my mom. And then, because that got a little bit uncomfortable and she was expecting an answer, I started to sneak around going to Mass at other churches so that she wouldn't find me. And finally, after this period of apparitions, if we can call them that, in which I was strengthened through the sacraments, my mom finally clinched the deal by asking me that deadly question of John 6. Why doesn't Jesus call the disciples back after talking about his body? Why does he not clarify that it's just a symbol? And because I was incapable of answering that question, and because it was a question that was bothering me, I started crying, and crying really hard. And finally I surrendered to the truth of the Catholic Church. And in 2011, on Easter Vigil, I was baptized with my parents and some of my brothers and sisters, and received my first communion.
I love the way that you draw the parallels to the apparitions at Fatima and along with Sister Lucia's story. When did you first learn about Fatima, and when did you make your first pilgrimage to Fatima?
Okay, so I first visited Fatima in 2014, and I'd love to tell you some beautiful story about how I learned about the message of Fatima through I don't know, some talk online or something like this. But the truth is, a group in my parish organized what I thought was a trip to Spain. and I didn't even realize that it was a pilgrimage until I had already bought the ticket to go with them. Otherwise, I probably would not have bought the ticket. And I didn't realize, I only learned on the plane, that we were going to be guided around by some nun from some alliance, something or another, through Portugal, which in reality does not make up part of Spain. And that was my first kind of exposure to Fatima. It was completely on accident, which was a great grace. Sometimes God works on accident.
Tell me about the process from having that first exposure with the sisters, then returning to the States, and what eventually drew you into wanting to consider and ultimately enter religious life.
So I'll be honest, I was a Protestant. So my vast knowledge about religious life and consecrated life was the penguin-looking women from Sound of Music. If someone had asked me if I had ever thought about becoming a nun or religious, I probably would have laughed and said, yeah, right after I pursue my dreams of becoming a ballerina and an astronaut. It was very much not a part of my life dreams at all. I hadn't thought about it whatsoever. And then something happened, and this one was very strong. It was another apparition, I would say, just like Lucia in 1917. Our Lady stepped down from heaven and stepped into my life. As I toured through Fatima and I started to hear the message, I started to feel something was changing. Once again, God was taking another shape, another figure much more clear. And I started to notice that the sister that was showing us all the sights actually seemed rather normal, not penguin-y at all. I liked her. She was young. She knew how to laugh. She knew how to tell a joke. And then I met the rest of her sisters. And it was more of the same, which was pretty confusing for me, considering I hadn't really had that much exposure to young consecrated women. And this whole thing was very, very confusing and very much not a part of my plans whatsoever. But I felt like I had to understand more. There was something there that I couldn't really put my finger on, but I had to understand more. What made these young, normalish women leave the real world and join a convent? What made them smile? What made them look at each other the way they did? What made the love in their voice echo the way it did? Even with their funny accents, I could understand that there was something there that I didn't have. So I finished the pilgrim with those sisters, and I went home, back to my life, back to work, back to my boyfriend, back to my job, back to my family. But I still had these questions on my heart and on my head. And my head doesn't let me sleep when I have a lot of questions. So I got online and I looked up that sister, and I started to ask her about her story, about her vocation, and what made her leave, and what made her stay, and what. She was pretty patient, answered as much as she could, and finally said, look, if you really need to know all of this, you probably should think about coming out and visiting. And hold on, cowboy, I'm not going to become a nun. That's nuts. I live in the States. I'm very happy. But I still had those questions, and I still had that doubt, and I still had this new face of God before me that I had to figure out. So here's how I justified everything in my head. I was going to go visit the sisters. This was in May 2015. But it wasn't to become a nun at all. a religious sister at all. I was going to a museum to see the art pieces, not to stay there in the museum as an art piece. And that was my spirit when I went. I went there very much to prove that I didn't have a vocation, that it was all crazy. And luckily that didn't happen. I spoke to the Mistress of Novices at the time, Sister Marta, and we started, the both of us, a period of discernment. I returned to the States, and God's new apparition changed my life. Our Lady changed my life. And in 2016, on February 2nd, I entered Aliança de Santa Maria, and I've been there ever since.
Of course, and you've mentioned it during some of your answers today, our theme of be not afraid. What specific fears or concerns did you have to overcome? As you said, you were comfortable in the United States. You make this transition to a completely different country. What fears did you have to overcome in this process of trusting the Lord more?
Well, it's an interesting question, because I would say that it was both terrifying, but not quite as terrifying as becoming Catholic. I believe it was more of a consequence of my true vocation, which is to Christ. What's scary? I have to leave my language. And that's kind of a security that I like to have. I have to leave my boyfriend, my job, my family. It's all nuts. The entire life's completely nuts, and that causes a lot of fear. But it's interesting to look at the Bible, as Sister Ana Luisa already spoke about it. The Bible says, don't be afraid. It doesn't say don't feel afraid. And I think that's something that we have to have very present when we're looking at vocational questions or stories of conversion or life in general, is that we're going to feel fear. I feel fear now. I feel fear because of the COVID, because of, my family, because of people that I've lost or people that I might lose. And I understand that that's a feeling of helplessness, but it's not a part of who we are. Be afraid is not a part of who we are. And feelings pass. The one time Sister Marta and I were talking about fear, and she said that we can be afraid all we want to, because when we do things while we're afraid, we're courageous. If we do things when we're not afraid, we just have common sense. So the important thing for us to conversion, and when God shows up out of nowhere with something new for us, is that fear is not deadly, but being paralyzed by fear can be.
I think that's a wonderful theme and message to end on, Sister Brittany. I appreciate you joining us today. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.